The picture.
Oh, shoot.
With it today, thank you. Now we're good.
All right, so like I said, I read Religion and the Racist Right, The Origins of the Christian Identity Movement, and that's a book by Michael Barkin, who I looked up, and he is, I believe, political science at Syracuse. So the purpose of this book, as he stated, was to understand where the identity movement originated. It's largely been thought that the identity movement started in the 20th century in America, but that's not really the whole picture. So instead he goes back to the 19th century in Britain to an idea that's called British Israelism. In addition to understanding where that movement came from, he also identifies the key actors in both British Israelism in the United States and Christian identity movement when it finally changed over to that. So the three key actors he identifies are Howard Rand, William J. Cameron, and Wesley Swift. And he wrote this book to expand because he saw a lot on the media of people talking about the Christian identity movement as them being like Nazis or white supremacists. And while he says that's not necessarily untrue, it is incomplete and doesn't necessarily offer a complete picture of what's going on in that movement and what their belief system is. One of the quotes he uses, he says, that odd and repellent belief systems can be important regardless of what academics may think if their believers take them seriously and act upon them. And of course, believers in the Christian identity movement do that. They do believe in them and they do act on those ideas. So like I said, it originated in 19th century Britain, and it was based on the idea that Britain was one of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. That Anglo-Saxon people or Nordic people are direct link to the lost 10 tribes and therefore are God's chosen people. They think the British Israelists believe that the Bible is a reliable racial guide. And so they believed that, white Anglo-Saxons were superior, but they didn't necessarily think that Jews were all bad. They thought they were good and bad Jews, and that Jews were capable of being redeemed if they would only subscribe to Christianity. What marked British Israelism is the fusion of politics and religion and mysticism, in addition to religion. And so there's this really odd tie-in with pyramidism, which is the idea that we can tell time from the pyramids, and there's measurements involved and a pyramid inch, and so that was mixed in. And it was never an official religious sect, and so British Israelists were not necessarily British Israelists. That's not all they were. They could be other religions as well as British Israelists. And so in the 1870s, that idea moved from Britain over to the United States, where it landed on the east coast of the United States in Brooklyn. Howard Rand, one of the key players that I was talking about, he was really the mastermind behind it. And so he would take these British Israelist ideas and kind of form them into a form that people in America could identify with, rather than British Israelism. It became Anglo-Israelism. So he kind of made that switch over. And then William J. Cameron, another one of the key players I identified, was really the public face of British Israelism. So he did a lot of the going out and getting people interested in the movement and doing some sermons. Like I said earlier, it wasn't necessarily tied to anti-Semitism when it first began. That really happened during the Depression era, is when those two things really got linked. And then after World War II, it separated from its British roots entirely. So some of the key beliefs of the identity movement, not British Israelism. I'm actually going to come back to that. So like I said, it started in Brooklyn with Rand and Cameron, but then Cameron defected and Rand was never a good public figure, and so it eventually died out in Brooklyn on the East Coast. In the 1940s, in the later 1940s, it kind of rekindled when a group from Vancouver brought those beliefs down to California, LA specifically. LA was really a great breeding ground for this movement because there was a lot of racial and ethnic diversity that was starting to crop up there, and so there was a lot of mixing of new ideas, and so it was very easy for people to see that new diversity and be kind of afraid of it. They also used communism as a tool, and so like McCarthyism was a big thing. They equated Jews with communists and talked about how terrible communism was. One of the biggest things about both British Israelism, Anglo-Israelism, and the Christian identity movement is that it's so open to change. And so one of the quotes from the book is, "Precisely because it is a fragmented world with leaders who often compete, organizations that rapidly form and split, and a disinclination to accept a comprehensive structure of coordination, its development is subject to sudden swings." And another thing which we'll see throughout when I talk about this is that the changes can't necessarily be anticipated. So because there's not like a figurehead, you can't really identify what the movement's next moves will be. So as it switched from Anglo-Israelism to Christian identity movement as we know it now, two of the most important people in that were Gerald L.K. Smith and Wesley Swift. Gerald L.K. Smith was the most prominent anti-Semite in the 1940s. He was also a political agitator. He had a very staunch right-wing agenda that he pushed out. And he was really responsible for giving the movement coherence, because when it was Anglo-Israelism, it didn't necessarily have the nice coherence that made it a solid movement and capable of withstanding time. That's where Smith really came in and made the movement more cohesive across different parts of LA and later when it moved on to other parts in the country. And then Wesley Swift, Michael Barkin calls him the most significant person in the early history because he combined British Israelism, anti-Semitism, and political extremism in this very condensed, very concentrated form of Christian identity. He founded what was called the Anglo-Saxon Christian Congregation, which later became the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, which should sound familiar to everyone. And then another thing that he was known for that I thought was kind of important was that he attempted to revive the KKK in LA in 1946. And then while Swift and Smith were, creating the Christian identity movement, Swift actually brought Richard Butler, the person from Church of Jesus Christ Christian in Coeur d'Alene, into his church, and he saw some of the sermons that Swift was giving, and so he became a major actor in the movement. He transformed Christian identity to a very highly politicized and violent movement, as we all know. In the 1970s, Christian identity really tried to make themselves distinct from two groups, British Israelism and fundamentalism. So to make them distinct from British Israelism, they abandoned the pyramidism and adopted a more anti-Semitic worldview and ideology. And to make themselves distinct from fundamentalism, they made it clear that they were they had an aversion to the idea of the rapture. They saw the rapture as cowardice and a retreat, and they saw the apocalypse. They did think there was going to be an apocalypse, but it wasn't necessarily going to be something that everyone left. It was a race war between Aryans and Jews, and it was welcomed. And they thought that, if you tried to avoid it, you were weak and a coward. And so with that train of thought comes a militarized apocalypse. And so, like I said, they saw it not only as like natural but inevitable. But the disaster they saw wasn't of natural causes, like a lot of rapture ideas are. It's not like, a hurricane or a tornado or anything like that. Instead, it would be demographic. And so the damage done would be racial obliteration of white people. And they believed that the Jewish people's denial of Jesus is what halted God's promises to them. They saw traditional churches as impure, and they saw the rapture as not something to be taken out of but protected through, and they really believed that God would do that. They thought that they would be protected through this racial obliteration. And so one of the quotes that they linked this group to was, "It wasn't raining when Noah built the ark." And that kind of is a good analogy that they used, because they said, while we may not be under serious distress right now, Noah wasn't either, but he still built the ark, and so we still need to arm ourselves and get ourselves ready for military action. They weren't concerned with date setting because they knew it was inevitable, and they just wanted to prepare and be ready whenever it happened. The movement changed again in the 1990s as they distanced themselves from the anti-Semitism that marked the 1970s, 1980s. They were more concerned with, they considered themselves to be the carrier and guardians of mainstream American values. And so what they mainly thought of there was like the Constitution. And so it was their job to protect the Constitution, literally, every word of it. There was no, there was no analyzing the Constitution. It was what it was, just like the Bible is holy text. The Constitution would be considered a holy text that's infallible. And another thing that really made their movement, that was characteristic of their movement, was that they thought that any argument advanced against it could be incorporated into the theory. And so even if people said negative things about them, it was just because the mainstream media and mainstream education were turning people against them because they had such great ideas. And they thought that since victory is assured, what appeared to be defeats didn't need to be taken seriously because it was just a small hiccup on the way to like their greater success. Another thing is that they had like invisible militias, and they became much more conspiratorial. They believed highly in the New World Order as they saw it, where Jews had control over academics, politics, and media. But when they were able to gain political office, they saw that as like a mainstreaming of their views. They talk about a couple of people. Unfortunately, I didn't write that down. Some positives of this book were that it provided a more comprehensive explanation of Christian identity history. So I had no idea that British Israelism was even a thing, and so it was really interesting to read about that. It's obviously based on extensive research, and it is an academic piece of writing, which gives it a lot of credibility. Unfortunately, that credibility and that academic writing style that they use may not necessarily turn people over to understanding how problematic this group is, because if they are like on the fringes of this movement, they'll see this book as like, yeah, of course, the Jews, you know, they're in the academics and they're part of the problem and they're just, you know, releasing propaganda. Another thing is that it does make the writing a little less accessible than some other books we've read in class. It's pretty dry, and I had to reread some portions of it. I also thought the layout made it a little repetitive, as they had like the timeline and then the ideology, and so like they talked about stuff in the timeline and the ideology and the ideology and the timeline, so it got kind of a little repetitive.
Okay. Time for a quick question of our presenter. Anyone have a question they want to offer?
Did they ever discuss kind of the threats that this group has, or was it mostly based on like their ideology and the roots of the movement?
Not explicitly, but I think that what he was trying to hint at here is that they are so fragmented and leaderless that that's one thing that can be negative, but it's also one of their greatest strengths, because you can take this ideology and apply it to just about any religion or, you know, worldview.
Your time for one quick question. Did he talk about any other religions in the right?
No, he just talked about Christian identity movement, and so he didn't really necessarily like focus on like Lutheran or like any particular Protestant sects, because that's kind of irrelevant, honestly, you know.
Okay. All right. Thank you.